Good morning, good afternoon. I've been talking about the welfare state. We have looked at the history in the different countries and different regions. And we are now going to look at the welfare state developments as it happened in Latin America. The welfare states in Latin America have been considered as welfare states in transition or emerging welfare states. They were actually going through a fundamental change. Welfare state in Latin America have been described as truncated, generous benefits for formal sector workers, regressive subsidies, and formal barriers to the poor to the benefit to obtain benefits. Mesolago has classified the countries taking into account the historical experience of their welfare systems. The pioneers were Uruguay, Chile, and Argentina, as well as they started to develop the first welfare programs in the 1920s, following the Bismarckian model. Like I said before, Bismarckian model is Germanic, and so the actually were following the Europeans, and other countries such as Costa Rica developed a more universal welfare system in the 1960s and 1970s with the social security program based on the Beveridge model. Beveridge was actually in England, and the great thinker who wrote a report, the Beveridge report, if you remember it, and which gave rise to modern day the welfare state in Britain. So the South Americans were also following that. Researchers such as Martinez, Franzoni, and Barbara Solano have examined and identified several welfare regime models based on the typology of S.P. Anderson. These are scholars and thinkers. Other scholars, such as Riesco and Cruz Martinez, have examined the welfare state development in the region. About welfare state in Latin America, Halek Segura Obriego wrote, Latin American countries can be unequivocally divided into two groups depending on their welfare um, effort levels. The first group, which for convenience we may call the welfare states, including Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Costa Rica, and Brazil. Within this group, average social spending per capita the 1973 in the 1973 to the 2000 period was around dollars 522 and 532, while as the percentage of GDP and as a share of the budget, social spending reached 51.6 and 12.6% respectively. In addition, between approximately 50 and 75% of the population is covered by the public health and pension social security system. In contrast, the second group of countries, which we call non-welfare states, as welfare effort indices that ranges from 37 to 88. Within this second group, social spending per capita averaged US dollars 96.6, while social spending as a percentage of GDP and as a percentage of the budget averaged 5.2% and 34.7% respectively. In terms of the percentage of the population actually covered, percentage of the active population covered under the same social security scheme does not even reach 10%. In the Middle East, we look at the Nordic country. In the Nordic welfare model, the Nordic welfare model refers to welfare policies of the Nordic countries which also tie into labor market policy. So we talk of jobs. Sometimes if we talk about the welfare state, people think we are talking about the government helping people who are actually unemployed. But the strength of the welfare state and its development was actually also focusing on employment. The employment policy, like we see, and even the experience of the Nordic economy, um, um, welfare, the modern, the Nordic model of welfare is distinguished from other types of welfare state by its emphasis on maximizing labor force participation, promoting gender equality, egalitarian, and extensive benefit levels, the large magnitude of income redistribution and liberal use of the expansionary fiscal policy. So things like taxation and control over spending and using tax revenue to strengthen the welfare state. So it was more integrated in most other states at that time. So while there are differences among the Nordic countries, they all share a broad commitment to social cohesion and universal nature of welfare provision in order to safeguard individualism by providing protection for vulnerable individuals and groups in society and maximizing public participation in social decision making. It is characterized by flexibility and openness to innovation in the provision of welfare. The Nordic welfare system are mainly funded through taxation, like I said previously. So in China, the social welfare in China was traditionally relied on the traditionally relied on the extended family to provide welfare services. The one-child policy introduced in 1978 was made that actually made that unrealistic, and new models have emerged since the 1980s as China has rapidly become richer and more urban. Much discussion is underway regarding China's proposed path toward the welfare state. Chinese policies have been incremental and fragmented in terms of social insurance, privatization, and targeting. In cities where rapid economic development has centered, lines of cleavage have developed between state sector and non-state sector employees and between labor market insiders and outsiders. In Sri Lanka in 1995, the government started the Shamudi Prosperity Program aimed at reducing poverty, having replaced the Jana Sahiva Savia Poverty Alleviation Program that was in place at that time. In Singapore, the government provides financial and social support through a variety of social assistance schemes for lower and middle income Singaporeans. The Ministry of Social and Family Development runs ComCare, a program which provides income support for low income citizen households through various schemes for short to medium term assistance, long term assistance, child support, and urgent financial needs. The Community Development Council also run various local assistance schemes within their districts. The Ministry of Manpower runs Silver Sports Scheme, which provide additional financial support for low-income elderly with no family support. Like I said, the welfare state was also for jobs and not just for the jobless, among other things. Meanwhile, if you want to look detail of what we discussed, we have 9 other videos. This is now the 10th and the 11th, respectively, video on the welfare state. They ran for about 10 to 15 minutes each video. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Health also ran Medifund to assist anyone on their behalf to pay off the rest of their medical bills after initial government subsidies, other health financing schemes, as well as funds from the Central Provident Fund has been used. Like we said, the one of the biggest spending, public spending on the welfare state is on healthcare up and down the globe, especially in Europe and in the developed world. In 2012, the Community Health Assist Scheme (SHASH) was introduced. In a medical card that provides extended subsidies exclusively for Singaporean citizens, usually from lower to middle income households, as well as the older generation, where they could receive treatment for common illnesses, chronic health problems, and specific dental issues at private clinics for free. The intention behind the scheme was to encourage Singaporeans to use such a card and tap into the private healthcare sector for common and minor chronic illnesses, as well as dental care to reduce strain at public community hospitals. Now, in Singapore, they are now this is actually the process of privatization, fully privatizing the healthcare in Singapore, but still the state can support and regulate the private sector as effectively as to actually provide for the public, which is something which the UK can do, as well as the US and the rest of the European. This is actually Singapore. So the intention behind the scheme was to encourage Singaporeans to use such a card and tap into the private healthcare sector for common and minor chronic illnesses, as well as dental care to reduce the strain at public community hospitals. Originally, only a blue and orange card existed depending on their household income. So it was in means tested as well. If you had more or less, then you got more or less according to whether you can afford or more or less affordance. As a result, all Singaporeans became covered for chronic and common illnesses, as well as dentistry and privately owned clinics. In the UK now, there's a serious crisis within the dental sector, where NHS, the National Health Service, government-funded section of the healthcare, there is now, you struggle now to book appointments in the UK. This is what is now happening within the general practitioners, the private, clinic, which actually provided health support for families in the UK. So they could do something similar like in Singapore. As a result, the subsidies for complex chronic conditions was also increased. In addition, the National Council of Social Services coordinates a range of 459 governmental voluntary welfare organizations to provide social services while raising funds through the Community Chest of Singapore. Taking the World Bank's International Poverty Line (IPL's) poverty threshold into account, the population of Singaporeans living below the poverty line is virtually non-existent. Singapore also has one of the highest housing ownership rates in the world, over 90%, owing to the government's policy of constructing extensive and quality public housing throughout the country and providing extensive subsidies for its citizenship to obtain them. So a country like Great Britain, America, and most European countries can actually learn a lot from Singapore, the Singaporean experience, who have virtually actually almost eradicated poverty in their country. If through the welfare state, they can actually achieve 90% of the Singaporeans actually owning property. That is, even Africans can now, even the dictators in Africa can now think of the Singaporean model to try and provide for their citizens some meaningful format of welfare state. We are looking at the United Kingdom now. The welfare state in the United Kingdom produced what in Britain was the welfare state. Is actually seen by the writing of historian Derek Fraser, which wrote it germinated in the social thought of late Victorian liberalism, reached its infancy in the collectivism of the pre and post Great War statism, matured in the universalism of the 1940s, and flowered in full bloom in the consensus and affluence of the 1950s and the 1960s. By the 1970s, it was in decline like the faded rose of autumn. Both UK and US governments are pursuing in the 1980s monetary policy inimical to welfare. The modern welfare state in the United Kingdom began operations with the liberal welfare reforms of 1906 and up to 1914 under Liberal Prime Minister H. Asquith. These included the passing of the Old Age Pension Act in 1908, the introduction of free school meals in 1909, and the Labor Exchanges Act 1909, the Development and Road Improvement Funds Act of 1909, which heralded greater government intervention in economic development, and in the National Insurance Act of 1911, setting up a national insurance contribution for unemployment and health benefits from work. So, as we said elsewhere in the other videos, the welfare benefit actually included public economy to the extent of even broad economic and economic infrastructure like road, housing, um, public transport, and so on and so forth. The People's Budget was introduced by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, in 1909 to fund the welfare reforms. After much opposition, it was passed by the House of Lords on 29th April 1910. The minimum wage was introduced in the United Kingdom in 1909 for certain low-wage industries and expanded to numerous industries, including farm labor, by 1920. However, by the 1920s, a new perspective was offered by reformers to emphasize the usefulness of family allowance targeted at low-income families was the alternative to relieving poverty without distorting the labor market. So the trade unions and the Labour Party adopted this view. In 1945, family allowance were introduced, minimum wages faded from view. Talk resumed in the 1970s, but in the 1980s, the Thatcher administration made it clear it would not accept a national minimum wage. Finally, with the return of Labour, the National Minimum Wage Act 1998 set a minimum of £3.60 per hour with lower rates for younger workers. So this is employment policy from the welfare state. It largely affected workers in high turnover service industries such as fast food restaurants, and members of ethnic minorities. December 1942 saw the publication of the report of the Interdepartmental Committee on Social Insurance and Allied Services, commonly known as the Beveridge Report, after its chairman, Sir William Beveridge. The Beveridge Report proposed a series of measures of the Interdepartmental Committee on Social Insurance and Allied Services, commonly known as the Beveridge Report, after its chairman, Sir William Beveridge. The Beveridge Report proposed a series of measures to aid those who are in need of help or in poverty, and recommended that the government find ways of tackling what the report called the five giants: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. It urged the government to tackle steps to provide citizens with adequate income, adequate healthcare, adequate education, adequate housing, adequate employment, proposing that all people working age should pay a weekly national insurance contribution. In return, benefits would be paid to people who were sick, unemployed, retired, and widowed. The Beveridge report assumed that the National Health Service would provide free health care to all citizens and that a universal child benefit would give benefits to parents, encourage people to have children by enabling them to feed and support a family. The We have discussed this in the other video in relation to other Europeans' experience. What Britain produced is not really different, but only that Britain introduced it far, far late after most of the European countries already done it. The report stressed the low cost and efficiency of universal benefits. Beveridge cited miners' pension schemes as an example of some of the most efficient available and argued that a universal state scheme would be cheaper than a myriad of individual friendly societies and private insurance schemes, and also less expensive to administer than a means tested government run welfare for the poor. The Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, and then the Labour Party all agreed Beveridge report's recommendation. Following the Labour election victory in the 1945 general election, many of Beveridge's reforms were implemented through a series of Acts of Parliament. On the 5th July 1948, the National Insurance Act, National Insurance Assistance Act, and National Health Service Act came into force, forming the key planks of the modern UK welfare state. In 1949, the Legal Aid and Advice Act was passed, providing the fourth pillar of the modern welfare state, access to advice for legal redress for all. As I speak now, most of the laws set to support legal system, the legal access to law in the form of legal aid, most legal aids have now been cut. So lawyers are now getting out of work because the government used to support the legal establishment, the lawyers, and the courts using public money. But now, because of cuts in public service, cuts in public funding, and reduction in public services, access to law is a problem because even lawyers are actually losing their contracts. You can give free legal advice if the government is not really giving you money, and you cannot find clients in the main market because the main market, mostly big legal firms, are getting they probably get money still from the government anyway, but mainly wealthy people can afford access to law. They can pay lawyers. Incidentally, they pay wealthy lawyers, but the majority of lawyers and the law firm used to rely on the government, public funding, to provide free legal services for the majority of the population who were poor within the public sector, specifically within the welfare state. Welfare state actually access to law, as in getting legal advice and support, is actually part of the welfare state. Before 1939, most healthcare to be paid for through non-governmental organizations, through a vast network of friendly society, trade unions, and other insurance companies, which counted the vast majority of the UK working population as members. Like I said in the other video, the third sector, the voluntary sector, is actually charities or NGOs. the government had been using to supplement public administration and delivery, including the welfare state. This organization provided insurance for sickness, unemployment, and disability, providing an income to people when they were unable to work. As part of the reform, the Church of England also closed down its voluntary relief networks and passed the ownership of thousands of church, schools, hospitals, and other bodies to the state. The church in Europe, including America, including religious orders and spaces around the globe, participated actively to establish the welfare state in Britain. The Church of England, which is the central institution of the Anglican Christian denomination, were actually providing relief aids and all sorts of help for social welfare services, things like schools, primary schools, secondary schools, and other form of support. So today, most food banks are actually in churches. When people are running away from their homes this winter because they cannot afford energy, they're going into churches and town halls. So actually, the British people are actually fleeing their homes because of poverty. It's like um, it's like they are being immigrants in their own country because of poverty. We have exceeded our target of we are now 26 minutes. So let me stop this video and carry on in the next one. Thank you. Bye bye.